Hello, and welcome to Climate Fix Podcast. Here we dive into evidence-based solutions to climate change and various other pressing environmental issues. This podcast is created by Americans for Nuclear Energy, a pro-nuclear environmental organization. We take no money from industry or special interest groups. All donations are from individuals like you, interested in a grassroots scientific movement to solve the world's most pressing scientific problem, global climate change. We hope you approach these ideas with humanism and an open mind. Our mission statement is as follows. Nuclear energy is safe, cheap, plentiful, clean, and efficient. It has the capability to stop and reverse climate change while addressing the ever-growing demand for electricity globally. We strive to educate American citizens about this technology and to dispel misconceptions with facts. We firmly believe that both human civilization and industrialism can easily coexist with a healthy environment. Join us in helping to plan a prescription for a feverish planet, or as we like to say, a climate fix.
This is your host, Phil Ord.
And this is your co-host, Colby Kirk.
The name of this episode is called Selling Power, Not Fear. We talked to Bret Kugelmass, director of the Energy Impact Center and host of the Titans of Nuclear podcast. Bret is a very inspirational speaker and ardent supporter of nuclear power as a means to really get runaway climate change under control. In a controversial view, Bret is convinced that the nuclear industry itself has engaged in scare tactics surrounding nuclear power, severely hobbling most nuclear build-out since the mid-1970s. We talk about this and other issues in the industry that need fixing in order to actually grow again.
Here's some background information on our guest. Bret is a former technology entrepreneur and has dedicated his focus to climate and energy challenges. From 2012 to 2017, he was an early pioneer in commercializing drone technology. He founded, ran, and sold a business called Airframe, which specialized in internet-controlled drone fleet technology. This company involved diving into complex technical, regulatory, and public opinion frameworks. It was eventually acquired by a Fortune 500 company. Bret attended undergrad at Stony Brook University, where he received a Bachelor's of Science in Mathematics. In 2011, he completed graduate school at Stanford University, receiving a Master's of Science in Mechanical Engineering.
Bret has been involved in many projects. In 2007, he worked as a roboticist at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, where he worked on a lunar rover control device. In 2008, he was a researcher at the UC Berkeley Condensed Matter Physics Lab and focused on scanning tunneling microscopy analysis of organic semiconductors. In 2009, Bret was a mechatronics engineer at NanoSolar, where he was working on thin film solar design and automating solar manufacturing processes. From 2010 to 2011, he was a lead researcher at Panasonic Innovation Lab, working on a concept shareable, foldable electric city car.
Motivated by the dire threat of climate change, Bret has been serving as managing director of the Energy Impact Center since 2017, which is a DC-based research institute that analyzes solutions for a net negative future by 2040 and is especially interested in exploring the challenges and opportunities for the role of nuclear power in deep decarbonization. Many know Bret from his hosting of the Titans of Nuclear podcast, which he started in 2018, doing hundreds and hundreds of interviews with nuclear power experts across the fields of economics, policy, and technology. He also has a large presence on YouTube, delivering many speeches and lectures to various universities, organizations, conferences, and political entities.
Wow, Bret has some great accomplishments and successes in rubber-to-the-road applications of engineering. It's no easy feat to start your own highly successful company and sell it to a Fortune 500 company. He has also dedicated his time into doing the homework necessary to truly understand the energy and climate problem, and genuinely is working to keep humanity in a thriving position.
It's also great that Bret is using his incredible mind to ask the tough questions that often push against the grain of conventional wisdom. New ways of thinking about things is integral to making large amounts of progress. We need to push hard, for not just a revival, but for growth in the nuclear industry. And Bret's style of advocacy, which highlights how self-imposed obstacles in the regulatory system, and emphasizing the untapped value of this technology, is a refreshing outlook on how we can be engaging in environmental activism. Firm honesty in confronting misconceptions with a passionate eloquence in describing the potential for a nuclear-powered future are valuable communication strategies to the pro-nuclear environmental movement.
Absolutely. We are very excited to get to talk to one of the up-and-coming movers and shakers in the nuclear power community. He brings up a lot of hope and optimism for the future by giving us a real path forward to deep decarbonization. Let's get right to it. Here's our conversation with Bret Kugelmass. Bret, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, many people know you as the brain behind the Titans of Nuclear podcast. You've conducted hundreds and hundreds of interviews with experts surrounding many aspects of nuclear power. This seems like an overly broad question, but what are some of the major conclusions you've reached from these discussions?
Yeah, okay, well, let's get right into it. I think probably the most counterintuitive and controversial takeaway that I've gotten from, what's been almost 1,500 interviews with experts over the last 3 years, has been that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with nuclear technology, and that the business model incentives of the nuclear industry itself has driven it into uneconomic competitiveness, and where the nuclear industry has really been its own worst enemies in the downfall of this use of this really magical technology.
That makes sense. Yeah, just talking to all the various aspects of it. Yeah, I think a lot of us get that kind of vibe. It's just like, if it's so good, why didn't it just take off?
Yeah.
You know, so.
Yeah, and I can elaborate a little bit more also if you'd like, but
sure.
The basic idea was that, when you built nuclear back in the 1950s and 60s, I mean, this is when they were talking about how like electricity was going to be too cheap to meter, right?
Yeah.
And it was, but that also meant that nobody was making any money. So the industry started looking for ways to make it more difficult, to make it more expensive, mostly driven by the utilities themselves. Electric utilities in the US at that time period operated on what's called a cost plus model. So they get paid a percentage of how much they spend. And so if they want to increase their total amount of profit that they bring into their organization, they have to spend more money. And so utilities themselves were not incentivized to sell cheap electricity. They were incentivized to sell as expensive electricity as they could get away with. And so that's what they did. And one of the ways that they did this specifically within the nuclear sector, where there was not much pushback, was by increasing the regulatory burden. So if you add all of these extremely detailed and extremely specific ways on how you have to build a nuclear plant, it makes it ever more expensive. And so these costs escalated from what was just a few $100 million to build a plant that could power a 1 million person city. 1 million person city. I mean, that's incredible that one building do that and build it for just a couple $100 million. They drove those costs all the way through the roof to what is now $10 billion for that same facility. And so they got away with this all the way through the 1970s, mostly driven by utilities themselves. And then it led to a total collapse in new development because public commissions and the federal government stepped in and said, this is just too expensive. Now we got to find other energy sources. But the problem is they'd already written the rules, so now that they couldn't get out of them. And this is why people think that nuclear is dangerous, because we've increased the regulations around safety so much, mistakenly think it's dangerous. And this is why nuclear is so uncompetitive, is because we've written into the rules over decades of ways to make it uncompetitive economically, intentionally.
And I want to clarify, people often say too cheap to meter, and a lot of people hear that and they think it was meant to be free. But what that statement was really referring to is kind of like how we have cell phone and internet today, where it's you get a bandwidth and you can use whatever within that bandwidth every month and you pay the monthly fee, but it's not metered.
Right, yeah. or water, right? Like in most places, you're paying per amount of water you use, but you don't really think about how much you're consuming, because you can pretty much use as much as you want, and it's like a difference between like on your bill, $30 or $35. It's not enough to think about when you use more. And by the way, that's what we want in society. That's how society becomes prosperous, when we create energy that is, quote unquote, too cheap to meter.
Basically, the cost of the wires to bring it to your house. That's pretty much
Right,
it.
exactly.
Yeah. Cool. Moving on, the climate problem is the reason why many people have taken a second look at politically incorrect nuclear power. You have the guts to say what many nuclear nerds are thinking, and that nuclear power is not part of the solution to climate change, but that nuclear power is the solution to climate change. What basic math and physics got you to rule out all other technologies?
Yeah, okay. And I can answer that in two ways. First off, maybe I'll try to take a stab at, why other people don't say it so as forcefully as I do. And then I'll actually explain the math behind it. I think at the end of the day, most people want to be liked more than they want. They want to actually solve a real problem at hand. So when it comes to climate, I think the strongest climate advocates are doing it because within their social circles, that is an acceptable persona for them to take on. It's an identity that they take on, that they get rewarded, not because they actually want to solve climate change. And the same with a lot of nuclear advocates too. People who are in the nuclear industry already get beaten up so much. They're constantly put on the defensive by people in their social networks, that they don't want to go that extra mile of saying, no, nuclear is the only technology that can get them out of this, because they want to at least have something that they can say with their friends, oh, let's all hold hands. You come with solar, you come with wind, you come with your idea, I'll come with my idea, and we can all have we can all be happy together. They prefer that over actually solving the climate problem. So I think that's one of the reasons that you hear so much about that. Now let's walk through the math. It's pretty simple. The biggest fallacy within the climate change arena is that if we got to zero new emissions, that the problem would solve itself. Most people think of it like they think of our issue with ozone depletion, that the Earth is self-healing on a couple decade time scale. That is not the case with climate. The carbon emissions that we've put into the air over the last 100 years or so will be a problem for many thousands of years. It won't self-heal. And so its heat capturing capacity will still remain even if we get to zero new emissions. So we could find ourselves in a situation where we do, quote unquote, everything right, get to zero new emissions, and yet every single year, until we hit a new equilibrium point, the temperature keeps on increasing and increasing and increasing. And most people would, at that point, say, wait a minute, we got tricked. We haven't actually solved the problem. Temperatures are getting hotter and hotter every year. Water levels are rising every year. What is this that we've been working on all of this time? And so that's the situation that we find ourselves in the zero new emission scenario. So what do we need to actually solve climate change? We need to go net negative, okay? And we need to go vastly net negative. So this is the beginning of the math that leads us to only nuclear. So if you're going to go net negative, you've essentially got two ways of doing it, biologically or technologically. Now there's certain limits on biology. You can only grow so many trees, and we could calculate how much carbon capturing capacity trees have over all the land on Earth if we used it, and it's just not nearly enough. As I like to say, we've burned 100 million years worth of trees in the last 100 years. The oil that we
That's a lot, yeah.
ground. Yeah. So you're not going to be able to plant 20 years worth of trees or 100 years worth of trees and get ourselves out of the situation. It just doesn't capture enough carbon. So you have to do it technologically. Now, any technological solution that we have is going to require energy in order to do this. And every energy source has a carbon footprint. So now you've got to go down the list and you have to say, okay, whatever carbon capturing technology that you're going to use, what are its energy requirements? And then you have to look at all the energy sources and say, well, how much carbon does it emit, right? Because if you are, requiring a kilowatt hour to remove, 20 grams of CO2, but to produce that kilowatt hour, with renewables, you have to emit 30 grams of CO2, your direct air capture system could actually have the opposite effect that you wanted. And so when you just run the math on carbon emissions for any energy source, and you look at our carbon capturing technologies and their energy requirements, there's a pretty clear line that only nuclear falls under. And it's just so obvious why. Because when you exploit atomic forces like nuclear does, instead of chemical forces like every other technology does, you're using orders of magnitude less mass, right? And
like 6 orders.
Yeah, oh, I mean, yeah, exactly. Like, it's just incredible. And so, and all carbon footprints of any energy source, your life cycle emissions, is tied to the amount of mass of your system. The amount of mass that you have to process, the amount of mass that you have to move out of the ground, the amount of mass that you have to transport. Everything is correlated to mass. And so what you need is the lowest mass or highest energy density system possible. And like you said, nuclear does that by 6 orders of magnitude. It is a no-brainer based on math alone.
You make a lot of sense. And I think what you've said before is that, and you talk about this, is that carbon negative fuels need to reach parity with and then become cheaper than carbon positive fuels.
Yep.
Can you explain this statement, and why is carbon negative so important? Which you've already kind of explained.
Yeah.
But
well, yeah. So I mean, if you create carbon negative fuels and just sell them into the global marketplace, the problem solves itself using market forces, and it perfectly aligns all incentives. If every ounce of energy that you're burning, right? If every ounce of fuel that you're burning or consuming has the net effect of taking carbon out of the air, then burn, baby, burn, right? It's like, let's build as much as we can. Let's drive as much as we can. Let's fly as much as we can. Let's, increase prosperity for 7, 8, and 9, and 10 billion humans on planet Earth as much as we can. And that is what is going to save climate. It totally deconstructs and reconstructs the paradigm around how to solve climate change. But it does so in a way where it's a win-win. But it requires producing carbon negative fuels that are cheaper than carbon positive fuels. And once again, mathematically, that can only be done with nuclear energy.
So basically you would have nuclear be so cheap that you would run a carbon sequestration system when you build a nuclear power plant. So it would produce electricity and suck carbon out of the air and still be cheaper than fossil fuel.
Correct. And when you look into like the actual mechanical systems involved in building a nuclear power plant, the synergies are just incredible. You already have to flow a large amount of coolant in order to create the cold side of your turbine, right? And so that same energy that's required to flow coolant, whether it be seawater, where you can capture CO2 out of, or air in air cooling systems, is half of the energy equation of a carbon sequestration system anyway. So you're getting half of it for free if you use nuclear.
So to clarify, like an example, when you say carbon negative fuel, I can think of like a carbon neutral fuel where we pull the CO2 out of the atmosphere, put it into synfuel, and then put that into a vehicle, which can then burn it back into the atmosphere. But if there's a policy framework where you say, okay, you pull a kilo of carbon out of the atmosphere, put that one in some basalt injection sequestration system, and then pull another one out, and then you could put that fuel onto the market. Is that what you're thinking, or is there like a different scenario?
I'm actually thinking something a lot simpler and a lot more like market friendly that doesn't require that policy. What I'm thinking is just literally the products that we use in our everyday life capture some of that carbon. So when we make plastics, we are sequestering carbon for thousands of years. When people say plastics last for thousands of years, oh my God, that's terrible. No, that's amazing because it can sequester carbon for thousands of years. So we should be building everything out of engineered plastics, including skyscrapers and buildings. And you could do that, by the way. Right now, we can make plastics with better structural properties than steel. It's just too expensive. With the system that I'm proposing, not only would it be cheaper and the buildings would perform better, it would also be a carbon negative system.
It seems like oil would be a good medium for this. like basically make synfuel oil that could be used for fueling our combustion transportation engines, and then also using that oil to make plastics.
Correct. That's exactly right.
Wow.
Cool.
So utilities and electricity economics are kind of hard for a lot of people to grasp, but you shed light on how utilities used to make their money on large capital investments, and this incentivized the project sizes to increase to the point where supply chains started to fall apart and costs dramatically increased. Can you expand on the process that led to the new nuclear capacity pricing itself out even before the 3 Mile Island scare?
Yeah, exactly. And this just harkens back to what we began our conversation with, but I'll get a little bit more specific. So one of the easiest ways to justify a large capital investment, which is what utilities wanted to do, because remember the cost plus model, that's how they made their money. The easiest way to justify it is to say, hey, we're going to give people more power. So let's just build a bigger facility. And historically, in the fossil industry, when we build bigger facilities, we get better economies of scale. We get more efficient burning of our fuel. So that's what we're going to do in nuclear too. And then everyone just rubber stamped that. They said, okay, yeah, this sounds like pretty logical. We'll just build bigger power plants. But what they didn't anticipate is that if you keep building bigger and bigger, and that's what they did, from 400 to 500 to 600 to 700 to 900 to 1,000 to 1,100, now up to 1,500 megawatts. And it's just so crazy. As you build that big, some of the components, you're narrowing the supply chain. So for instance, like your pressure vessel, your steam turbine, you are putting yourself in a realm where instead of the companies that make them having a factory already set up that can make 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 a year, like you can at the 500 megawatt level, now it's a factory that can only make one a year at the 1,100 megawatt level. And so now the price for that individual component goes through the roof just because you don't have economies of scale of manufacturing production within your supply chain. And so this is one of the things that drove nuclear into economic uncompetitiveness all the way through the 1970s. And then it was so economically uncompetitive, the public commissions shut them all down, 200 contracts were canceled, and this was the death of the nuclear industry. And this happened before 3 Mile Island. Most people in the nuclear industry blame it on 3 Mile Island because they're around the same time, and they want to look for an excuse for their poor economic performance that wasn't their fault. So they can just blame it on somebody else, blame it on bad happenstance, blame it on an accident, blame it on human factors, blame it on Jane Fonda, blame it on the environmentalists. But it's just blaming it on other people. It was their fault. They built a very difficult to construct series of nuclear power plants.
It seems like a problem with the old time, pre-1990s utilities vertically integrated system is that it caused these projects to get way too big, and then physically you just can't build the machinery to make it that big. It seems like that model is what killed nuclear power in the beginning. And is that kind of what you think?
Yeah, and we can see the same analogies in other industries too. So even like in space and everything, when you get to this realm that only a couple companies can make the key components, and it just doesn't become manufacturable, it doesn't become part of the standard supply chain. This was the end of space travel, right? Like we just built rockets that were too expensive, and that were controlled by like a consortium of just a couple defense contractors.
The space mafia.
So basically, space mafia. So instead of SLS, a bunch of SpaceX is competing.
Right, that's what I want to see in the nuclear industry.
One of your more what I call a spicy take is that the nuclear industry stopped being producers of nuclear power and started becoming producers of nuclear safety. You say the nuclear industry actually played into irrational radiation fears in order to win large and expensive safety overhaul contracts. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, sure. So I said the industry died in 1978. That's not exactly true. The developer side of the nuclear industry died, the side that was trying to sell power plants. But they still had their existing services business that was still intact, that sold upgrades into existing power plants. And so instead of pushing back on the public sentiment and the fear around 3 Mile Island, they actually hyped it up and they encouraged it. And they said, oh, you're right. You're so right. This was the worst thing that ever could happen. Oh my God, it would have killed 1 million people, which it couldn't have. It could have killed 0 people. So let's use regulatory capture in order to mandate upgrades to existing facilities. And this became the new nuclear business model. And so every time that there's been an accident or even a thought of an accident since, the industry goes back to the regulators and says, we want to do safety analysis and safety upgrade and safety equipment and redundant backup systems. And whereas, early on when they built these plants and they only made, the nuclear side maybe only made like 50 million, maybe $100 million per plant, because the plants themselves only cost like $400 million. The nuclear part was only a small piece of it. Now they're making $300–400 million per plant just on the upgrades. And so they tripled their entire market size, switching to this selling safety services and safety equipment. And this was all fueled by them exaggerating the risks of radiation itself. So they went around and they came up with all these new ways of measuring radiation, these new, they resurfaced some old ways like the linear no threshold model. They literally just changed the radiation standards. They said they got the radiation groups around the world to say it's 1,000 times more dangerous than it was yesterday. Not true. And that therefore increased the requirements for what it took to quote unquote protect the public. This became the new nuclear business model. So they got $300 million per plant after 3 Mile Island, another $300 million per plant after Chernobyl, another couple $100 million per plant after September 11th, another couple $100 million per plant after Fukushima. And every single time that an accident happens, even if it doesn't hurt anyone or doesn't kill anyone, or even in fact proves the need for less safety systems, the nuclear industry says, no, this is a reason that we need to upgrade our existing plants with more safety systems. And by the way, pay us extraordinary amounts of money to do this because it's in the interest of public health.
Just to add on that, there's this perception now that the decommissioning industry itself, there's this incentive to shut down the plants. Even if they could go for another 20 years, there's actually more money in shutting them down due to the all the money that goes into the decommissioning account. And that's another growing industry that's becoming very profitable to companies that are now working under this incentive system.
Correct. Yeah, out of one half of the industry's mouth, they're saying, oh no, we need to preserve existing plants. We need to keep them online. And then the other half of their mouth, they're actually the ones making the decision to shut them down because they get paid a lot of money. They've been putting money into these decommissioning funds that has been accruing interest over all these years. And now there's a pot of gold for the nuclear companies if they shut down nuclear plants.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this is almost just gotten to absurd levels to where it plays into the nuclear skeptics. They're just like, $1 billion to decommission a plant. That's more than plants used to cost, adjusted for inflation, half century ago.
Exactly. And this is why it's not irrational that the public hates nuclear, or that some part of the public, actually, I don't think most people hate nuclear. But the people who are skeptical, people who don't like it, they are not being irrational. They're acting super rationally compared, based on the information that the nuclear industry is putting in front of them.
Oh. So,
and like these scare tactics just got out of control. And then I think in another interview, I heard you talking about like how people took advice from the Union of Concerned Scientists that were full of a bunch of non-science members.
Yeah, pretty amazing.
Which is crazy.
Well, listen, you can start any think tank with any name that you want. And then, just get your people to, quote in op-eds and write a few articles here and there, position themselves as experts. Yeah. And if you've got a name, why not?
Designated Greenpeace nuclear expert has an opinion, and every newspaper publishes it. So oftentimes you go very hard against the regulators of the nuclear industry. You talk about how they have this absolute power to do whatever they want, no matter how absurd. Many in the nuclear movement agree with this assessment. How much blame do you put on the regulators for stopping nuclear progress, though?
Well, the industry itself, it's not just the regulators. I mean, the regulators are like born out of our own actions. And like, I don't want to disparage any like specific regulator or any person at the regulators. Like, they're just doing their jobs, right? But we have created a machine that makes nuclear more expensive through regulations, like intentionally. That is what the industry has done. And so, that is the way that you mandate these high costs. So if we want to have low costs, we have to figure a way to get out of those mandates. So, here's a good example. Like, one thing we could just do is just remove the nuclear regulatory bodies altogether. It's like, we still have all these other agencies that are required to make sure that facilities are physically safe. Like, we have
we
like,
don't have a fossil fuel
process.
Regulatory Commission.
Right. but like, the worst thing that could happen in a nuclear accident, most people think, oh, the worst thing that could happen is, it spreads out all this toxic radioactive radiation and kills all these people. So that's why you need this special body to like look at it. But that's not true. Like in the case of an accident, it doesn't spread enough radiation to hurt anybody in the public. So it's like, why would you need? Whereas, like, let's say if a building fell down, right, like a skyscraper, like 1,000 people would die instantly.
Yeah.
Okay, so like, we should have the exact same. I'm not saying we shouldn't have any regulations for nuclear power plants. They should just be the exact same as for like the building industry, right? Like assess the risk. Okay, if the building were to fall, it would kill someone inside the building. So we mandate what the rebar distance should be and the thickness of the concrete, and you just have a trained inspector sign off on it, and that's that. So you could do the same for the nuclear industry. Just make the regulations, part of what the building industry does, or the environmental industry, just fold it into their existing operations, and then then it would be on an equal playing field against all other buildings and technologies in terms of what the costs would be.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense.
So it's just putting things into proper perspective and having things hold the same amount of weight as other industries. If we can just hold things to that fair standard, the regulatory process wouldn't be such a, industry killer.
Right. I mean, that's if you want cheap energy. It's like,
right.
If you don't care about cheap energy, but you care about like how you feel about something, you have as many regulators and have as much expense as you want.
It's a jobs program.
And by the way, this is what we have in other industries too. I mean, there's a lot of things that are in place just because it makes us feel a certain way, and that's in some ways that's society's choice.
Interesting. You know what I was going to say is I'm a fan of libertarian philosophy, and I'm not sure how much I agree with parties and whatnot, but I was talking to a lot of people in the quote liberty movement, and they are very big supporters of nuclear power. And that kind of sounds ironic because it seems like costs have gotten so high, it takes big state actors to make these plants. But if we just adjusted the regulations, it would be cheaper than fossil fuel even.
Let me put it this way. If all you did was remove the radiation authorities, across the world, every human being on planet Earth would have clean air, clean water, and unlimited power, and all of that leading to just this huge increase in prosperity for no cost, right? Like, we wouldn't have to, no government would have to get involved with subsidies or anything. That would just happen on its own, just through the natural forces, if all you did was remove the powers of the radiation authorities.
Because it seems like, yeah, exactly. And it seems like if you look at it compared just based on the amount of fuel you need, the people that have the harder job are the fossil fuel people, because they have to move so many tons of stuff just to provide power. And we can get rid of that whole like extreme extraction that could undercut them on price. And I'm kind of rambling here, but
no, you're absolutely right. Who's like a nuclear fan has heard this like notion that like a Coke can worth of material could power your entire life. Well, let me just add something to that. Uranium is as abundant in the earth as tin is. And like you've had it like a thing, tin foil is now like aluminum foil, but it used to be tin. And you can imagine if you just went to the supermarket and bought one roll of tin foil, that was all you'd ever need for power consumption for everything you'd ever do flying around the world. Like that was all your costs were paid for by just digging one roll of tinfoil out of the ground. That's incredible. That's what nuclear can do. Like literally, this is the Earth, like the future of humanity that we want, right? Like everything you've ever seen in every science fiction episode of like where we could get in 2500, like we could have that now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we have this gift, this literal, if there was a God, or for those who believe there is a God, it seems like the uranium atom was put in the Earth's crust exactly to solve this problem.
Amen, brother.
So,
amen.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, moving on. You talked this a little bit about, the overblown risks of meltdowns, but can you go into some detail about how Fukushima really presented no real risk to the general public? And you talk in detail about how only a teaspoon of toxic radioactive iodine escaped containment during the accident. And I'm pro-nuclear, but I find that kind of a crazy notion. And if so, why this overaction by the Japanese government?
Yep. So let's go all the way back to Chernobyl just to kind of characterize like which radionuclides are environmental contaminants and which aren't. The most commonly accepted wisdom right now is that Chernobyl, which was the worst case scenario, graphite reactor blew up, caught on fire, all of the radioactive material that could possibly spewed out to the environment. And even in that case, only iodine-131 led to cancers. And that's just because there aren't that many radioactive elements that can move through biological pathways. Maybe cesium, maybe strontium, but the only one that can both move through biological pathways and accumulate in your body to the point of like giving you enough radiation, enough dose to cause a cancer is iodine-131. That's what we've learned from Chernobyl, and we could talk about it even if that's true at some point, but let's set that as a bounding condition right now. That most radiation scientists in the world agree that only iodine-131 is an environmental contaminant. And that was from Chernobyl. So now let's look at Fukushima. We saw here's an example of a light water reactor melting down. As a matter of fact, 3 of them, complete core meltdowns. The roof blew off. Tsunami, totally wrecked things and moved things everywhere. And so the building was just like totally exposed to the environment. And even in that case, with 3 gigawatt cores of a light water reactor melting down and being exposed to the environment, only 28 grams of iodine-131 went into the environment. 28 grams. And that is the equivalent of a little over 1 teaspoon worth of material. So you have the worst case possible scenario for a light water reactor, only 1 teaspoon of iodine-131, the only radioactive environmental contaminant that can cause damage to people, was released. So, I mean, that's pretty eye-opening. And that would even, if one were just being logical about the whole thing, one would say that, you don't need any safety. If every safety system is disabled and only 1 teaspoon of environmental toxin gets out, maybe you don't need any safety systems at all, would be the logical conclusion from that.
You just risk a totaling of your expensive machine, basically.
and just self-insure against that. That's what every other industry does.
Yeah, I saw this segment on 60 Minutes Australia, and Ben Hurd, you've interviewed him,
Yeah.
Our friend at Bright New World, big pro-nuclear guy who might end up persuading the continent of Australia to go nuclear. He visited on TV Fukushima. He's just like, this is a big industrial accident inside the perimeters of the building.
Yep.
I mean, within the confines of the plant itself, and it's not doing anything really to anybody outside of it. And it's just kind of amazing that, you say, I mean, I believe what you're saying, but it's like you even go to saying maybe the mega containment structures we have are unnecessary.
Yeah, and in this case, it was counterproductive. So like you could talk about containment or confinement. I would always advocate for confinement over containment, because containment creates a pressure boundary. So it's the equivalent of turning your hot pot into a pressure cooker, right? And pressure cooker can yield to a violent kinetic energy event that can spew material. So that's what happened, and even that wasn't enough to hurt anybody. But if you want to keep material in a certain place, what I would do is create a confinement barrier instead of a containment barrier. Just don't make it airtight, and you're totally fine.
Oh, so you have this notorious wager where you'll offer $10,000 to anyone who can prove that a meltdown from a light water reactor can hurt a member of the general public in a realistic scenario. And you have had zero takers. Can you explain why it's so hard to hurt the public with a light water reactor meltdown?
Yeah, so I mean, I based that wager initially off of just the evidence from Fukushima. If Fukushima, 3 gigawatt scale cores, the roof blew off, tsunami to shake everything up. If that wasn't enough to hurt a single member of the public with radiation, I'm like, well, what possibly could? But so that's just from empirical evidence. I can make the claim that it is impossible. And then if anyone wants to challenge me, great. I got a boatload of money to pay if you can prove me wrong. And then on top of that, we can also just talk about it analytically as well, why that's the case. And it's pretty simple. If you have any toxin whatsoever, the more that you spread it out across a larger volume, the more that you reduce its toxic efficacy, right? Its toxicity, right? Because it's a function of concentration. So I wouldn't want to drink a teaspoon of Clorox, but if you put a teaspoon of Clorox into a pool, I wouldn't mind, drinking a teaspoon of that. And if you put a teaspoon of Clorox into the 100 million acres worth of ocean, like what happened in Fukushima, it's not gonna cause a hazard. So sometimes people say dilution is the solution to pollution, and so the same thing applies with a nuclear meltdown. The very act of it escaping from the facility and spreading out across a volume, right, reduces its concentration and thus reduces its potency and thus makes it not a hazard anymore.
You learn that in principles of chemistry when you're working under a hood. The reason why you work under a hood is you don't want fumes and stuff to pollute the air you're right around, but let it go into the atmosphere and it degrades itself. Just mix it around.
Yep.
Yeah, the dose makes the damage is first rule of toxicity, and
yep.
It's another example I bring up in science communication where I think there's this when people were explaining they're putting the plutonium RTGs on spacecraft, and they're saying well, if the rocket explodes, it's just going to spread the plutonium over 200 square miles over the ocean. And to a scientist, that makes sense. Okay, it's not a problem anymore. But to the general public, that seems terrifying. That some radioactive material is going to be spread so widely open. So I think teaching just the basic principle of the dose makes the damage is so important for public literacy in science.
And yeah, I mean, it's I feel fine walking on a, like a street or the sidewalk of a street where there are cars next to me. But I don't feel so fine like when I'm right next to the muffler. Like sometimes you hold your breath when you walk past a car. And I certainly wouldn't feel fine if I put my mouth right up against the exhaust pipe, right?
Yeah.
And so that's just another kind of example of how we experience that in our daily lives.
Sure. Another thing you say that rubs people in the nuclear movement the wrong way is that nuclear power production side of things is riddled with bad engineering. You especially focus on engineering of containment structures and even go as far to say, as the containment we built today is not necessary. You already kind of described this, but let's get a refresher. What makes you say this?
Yeah, so yeah, we talked a little bit about containment versus confinement, but there's all sorts of other bad engineering as well. And this is primarily because most nuclear systems are designed to make nuclear expensive, not to make it inexpensive, right? That's the business model. So that's why I say it's bad engineering if what you're optimizing for is cost of electricity. But yeah, there are other examples like the containment structure where what you're saying is, hey, we're designing a system to make our system more safe, quote unquote. But in reality, it makes it more dangerous. So that's the whole thing about creating this like pressure cooker versus a hot pot type thing. They literally wrote into the rules, let's create a pressure cooker instead of a hot pot, whereas a hot pot is less dangerous. And they did it in the name of safety. And so the containment structure is just one example of that. But overall, I mean, we could extend this entire thesis to the whole concept of nuclear safety and nuclear costs in general. Like if what you care about is safety, what you want is to create as much of the power source that has the best safety profile, right? And so that, in order to do that, you just want to reduce the costs of that as much as possible. And so, we know that the fossil, industry has all these terrible consequences from an air pollution perspective. So we should build power structures that are cheaper than fossil plants. And then we'll save lives from not killing people with air pollution. And so you could even use the safety argument to say, hey, let's build nuclear power plants that are cheaper and even have less safety systems in them in order to save more lives. You could use it that way as well, but the nuclear industry doesn't do that, right? Because what they want to do is sell expensive nuclear power. That's how they make money.
Like you bring up the point about also, I think it was either containment or pressure vessels that they used to like weld together in pieces on site. And now they have to use like these large forgings to build them. And then I remember you said something like, it's bad engineering to not find a substitute way of making something that's cheaper that can do the exact same thing. And we've refused to do that. Like you were talking about something about the way we did welds back in the day with copper, and now we have different weld filler material where we can, I forget what you were referring to, but things like that. So like that's would be another example of the bad engineering, right?
Yeah, yeah, I'd be happy to explain that further. So, there's a requirement written into the rules that a reactor pressure vessel has to be forged. And what that means is you start off with a big chunk of metal and then you kind of stretch it out. Whereas, most pressure vessels are made through, you get a plate of steel or whatever material. And then it's a flat plate and you just roll it and you weld it along a seam and that's that. Now, when they did that early on in the nuclear industry, and they used to weld it with a welding material that had copper in it, the weld would become weaker than the outside structure because radiation affects copper in kind of a weird way, a copper alloy in kind of a weird way, where the copper groups together and then becomes brittle and then breaks under pressure. So they wrote in this rule, hey, it's got to be forged then. Instead of saying, well, why don't you just demonstrate sufficient strength properties and do it however is the best way to do it. And so, the best way to do it would just be, or the most economical and meeting the same structural requirements would just be, well, let's just weld it like we do every other pressure vessel, but with a different weld filler material, a non-copper based one, and then you wouldn't have the embrittlement problem. And so, so instead of doing it that way, they chose just to keep on and make it more complicated and keep designing around forged systems, and instead of challenging the very premise of why should this be forged at all.
Because in order to forge, you need these furnaces that are unfathomably large. When we even today we have additive manufacturing too, where we could even potentially layer by layer melt metal powder, right, to become its own pressure vessel. Do you think that that's also a new technological advancement for nuclear that could bypass the forging problem?
Well, the problem is complying with the requirements instead of challenging the requirements. There's a million ways to engineer systems, and I wouldn't speculate on the absolute best one. Maybe 3D printing could be the best, especially if you're working in some complex geometries, or if they're going to be kind of custom made to different applications or custom fit to this or that. That could be really interesting. It's also pretty easy to just kind of take a steel plate and roll it up and weld it as well. But the problem is the engineering mentality. The engineering mentality is to design to regulations instead of designing to your overall goal. And your overall goal should be economics, and then or you could say, hey, it's safety, but then actually design to make a safe system. Don't design to whatever the regulations say is safe.
Those darn regulations, man.
So it's no secret that you're a fan of light water reactors. And for anyone involved with the nuclear advocacy community, we see a lot of advocacy for advanced Gen 4 reactors, molten salt reactors, thorium, and all of these more experimental, future-oriented reactor designs. But what keeps you more committed to the current technology that we have available?
Yeah, so this is probably where I lose the most friends, because most people in the new nuclear advocacy world kind of agree with everything I'm saying up to this point. They're like, hey, you're logical, but God, I love molten salt, or I love high temperature gas reactors. That's what got me excited about getting into nuclear. Or thorium, oh my God, thorium. They watch a couple of YouTube videos, and here's how their thought process goes. They say, listen, nuclear is amazing. I kind of intuit the fundamental principles of energy density. I want to find a way to make it work. Clearly, the existing system isn't working, so I'm looking towards something new and magical in order to kind of do a reboot of the industry. And so they find some new technology. There's 50 different technologies that were all experimented with, in the early days of nuclear. So let's dust the book off the shelf of one of these old technologies and come up and rationalize why this solves all nuclear's problems. But if you don't understand what problem it is that you're trying to solve to begin with, then you're not going to get anywhere. So that's, most people like, different technologies. That's kind of the story of why they like them. Or they were a PhD or a professor that spent, 20 years worth of government grant money pursuing that technology. And so they've learned to love it and learned to come up with ways to think that it's the best. Whereas industry experience shows us that, if you want to build something that's cheap above all else, stick to the standard supply chain. Don't do anything funny with materials. Don't do anything funny with chemistry. That's how you get yourself in trouble. And so, I am sure that some of these other reactor types have their good purposes. Right, and maybe they will be in the future the best way to produce electricity too. Right now, you can make a good argument, why certain types of reactors are better for high temperature processes or this or that, or for space travel. Those are very niche applications, and you could probably make the argument for why they would be better even for electricity production if the entire supply chain was built out and if all of the operational issues were worked out. But they're not, okay? We've got, 100 years worth of experience with the steam Rankine cycle, with dealing with just like water-based power plant technologies. There's probably 100,000 power plants, when you look across like small ones for industrial applications, operating across the world today, and they all use water. Okay, there's a reason that they all use water. Okay, so like if what we're optimizing for is cheap electricity, is cheap power production, like stick with what like works in industry today and solve the challenges that are actually making it expensive. That's my general position.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm concerned that, for example, I like the lifter reactor, just the idea of it, but I'm like, look, do we really need to test out another thing? We could do like France did and pick a design or a few designs and just build it again and again and again until you get tired of building it to where it's easy. And I just figure, I think I like your philosophy of keep it simple, stupid, because we don't need to overcomplicate things. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with nuclear power today that we need to innovate a new design. It's,
Yeah, and what I would say, like, and like with your whole lifter comment, like you may be right. That might be the coolest, best, future energy source ever. Okay, so but if you really believe that, if you were a nuclear engineer and you really believe that is the best, then do me a favor, build 1,000 PWRs first.
Yes.
Get yourself a $100 billion a year R&D budget, because you're selling so many goddamn PWRs. You're just so filthy rich. You have all the money in the world to experiment with anything and solve any material issue, any corrosion issue, invent new pumps, invent a new supply chain. Do that first and then build your lifter, if you really believe.
One of the best features that, when people try to argue what reactor is the best based on what features they offer, the fact that if a reactor is on the shelf and can be built tomorrow, that's a pretty substantial feature over a lot of other hypothetical ones. So yeah, I agree. We got to do this job and solve this problem as fast as possible. And that requires getting reactors up and running as fast as possible. So we got to take what's on the shelf now, no matter what the future might bring.
The climate issue demands it. Like if things are as dire as people say they are, and we have to take that stuff out of the air again, we are losing time. The most dangerous reactor is the one that's not built, in my opinion.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's so good. That's so good.
You can steal that from me if you
want.
want.
I will. I love that so much.
Hey, Bret, we could talk to you forever, but we're reaching our end of our time for today. Is there anything else you wanted to chat about? And where can listeners learn more about you and the work done by the Energy Impact Center?
Yeah, no, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks for walking me through all this, guys. If you want to learn more about nuclear energy or kind of get hooked into the nitty-gritty details, you can listen to the Titans of Nuclear podcast. We've got almost 300 episodes online now. We'll probably do another 300 more before we're done. And we really just try to be as comprehensive as possible and just try to get into the weeds of every topic around policy, economics, technology, regulations, you name it. So that's one place, it's available wherever podcasts are, Titans of Nuclear. To follow the work that we're doing more broadly at the Energy Impact Center, you probably just follow me on LinkedIn. That's where I'm most active. I don't get on Twitter or any of the other social media sites just because most people that I need to interact with to kind of fulfill our mission here, they're in a more professional setting. So just follow me on LinkedIn, Bret Kugelmass, BretKugelmass. And that's where you can keep updated on all the other work that we're doing.
Awesome. I still find it amazing how many podcasts you did and so quickly. I'm just like, what's your secret? What is in the coffee you drink that's able to get you to do all this?
Yeah, motivation.
Motivation. Like what you're doing is so important. And, I find when I listen to your speeches and stuff, I just am inspired. And I think that we're missing that. And I think you're a voice that's desperately needed. And I don't know, I'm just a huge fan. So
thank you. No, this has been awesome chatting with you guys too.
Thank you, Bret. Yeah.
What a fantastic talk with Bret Kugelmass, director of the Energy Impact Center and host of the Titans of Nuclear podcast. Based on all the research he has done, he really knows his facts and brings some fresh insight into the task of expanding nuclear power generation in America and across the globe. Bret is very passionate and motivated by this issue, which is always needed in the pro-nuclear movement.
Definitely. He does a great job at framing the problem and providing a very straightforward solution, effectively communicating and motivating the target audiences needed to enact a nuclear revival that this planet desperately needs. Bret is also humanistic and approachable when it comes to bringing people on board with this mission. Phil, what are your thoughts on the conversation?
I like how Bret keeps things simple. We don't have to reinvent the wheel to make nuclear power a success story. We know what mistakes were made, and we can learn from the mistakes in the past in order to better deploy large amounts of this technology to turn the tide on the climate crisis. Many act as if carbon emissions are some sort of puzzle that requires some great restructuring of society. The solution is right in front of us, and it is nuclear power. How about you, Colby?
As exciting as future reactor designs can be, Bret makes the important case that we have fully operational light water reactors that work now as the best method of generating electricity, despite the obtrusive regulations holding them back. Even if the technology seems old, it still performs better than everything else we have, all things considered. In order to solve climate change and poverty, we need a massive global build-out of cheap, abundant, clean energy. And nuclear is the only thing that can do that. Bret understands the math behind both of these problems, and the math behind nuclear being the only core solution to fixing both. It was interesting to hear his findings on how to best reshape policy and make nuclear as competitive as it should be in a solution-oriented economy.
Absolutely. Thank you, listeners, for tuning into this episode of Climate Fix Podcast, entitled Selling Power, Not Fear. We also want to thank Bret Kugelmass for taking time out of his busy schedule to share his knowledge.
If you like what you heard and want more content, you can support Americans for Nuclear Energy's Climate Fix podcast on a per-episode basis with Patreon, link in the description. To support Americans for Nuclear Energy and our general mission, visit our website at www.americansfornuclearenergy.org. All words. Again, that's www.americansfornuclearenergy.org. We have a link to donate with PayPal under the Mobilize page. You can also purchase some Americans for Nuclear Energy swag under our store page. This will really help us pay for the little things, especially online service fees, to keep our organization running. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and YouTube. Lastly, we really want your feedback. Let us know your thoughts, questions, and concerns. We have a message form on our website under the About section, or you can email us directly at main@americansfornuclearenergy.org. All words. Again, that's main@americansfornuclearenergy.org. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Americans for Nuclear Energy's Climate Fix podcast. We'll see you next time.
Edited and produced by Jonna Adams.